She walked through the security checkpoint carrying a bright pink Hello Kitty purse, complete with sparkly sequins and a tiny bell that jingled with each step. Middle-aged, wearing a floral sundress and sensible shoes, she looked like someone's aunt heading to a book club meeting. The TSA agents barely glanced at her as she placed her purse in the bin, already dismissing her as just another harmless passenger. But when that scanner lit up and alarms started screaming, when trained professionals froze in panic at what they saw on their screens, she calmly stepped forward and said 5 words that changed everything. "I can handle this myself." What happened next wasn't just about defusing a bomb. It was about watching someone turn a lifetime of judgment into the kind of respect that saves lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning rush at Denver International Airport moved with its usual chaotic rhythm. Travelers shuffled through security lines, checking phones, juggling coffee cups, and muttering about delays. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that particular institutional glow that made everything look slightly unreal. I was working the X-ray machine, 3 years into a job that had long since lost any sense of excitement, when Margaret Chen stepped into my line. She stood out immediately, not because she was threatening, but because she was so completely ordinary, it almost seemed deliberate. Her pink purse caught the light as she placed it carefully in the gray plastic bin, the kind of accessory that screamed suburban mall shopping trip. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. Everything about her suggested someone who baked cookies for church functions and kept hard candies in her purse for grandchildren who visited on weekends. My colleague Jake Morrison was working the metal detector, a 20-something with an attitude that matched his oversized security uniform. He'd been making comments all morning about the passengers, the kind of running commentary that helped pass time during the monotonous shift rotations. When Margaret approached his station, I could see his smirk forming before she even reached the detector. "Ma'am, please remove any electronics from your purse and place them in a separate bin," he announced with exaggerated politeness, the tone people use when they're performing courtesy rather than feeling it. Margaret nodded politely and began removing items. Reading glasses case, travel-sized tissues, a small coin purse with cartoon characters embroidered on the fabric. Each item seemed to confirm Jake's initial assessment that this was exactly the type of passenger who would ask 3 times which gate she needed and hold up the line looking for her boarding pass. The X-ray monitor flickered as her purse passed through the scanner, and I found myself doing the automatic scan for prohibited items. Water bottles, electronics, anything that might require additional screening. But what appeared on my screen made me blink hard and look again. The image was wrong. All wrong. Dense, geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in a grandmother's purse. Components that triggered every alarm system we had. Patterns that made my training kick in with sudden, sharp clarity. The machine began its warning sequence. A series of beeps that escalated into the full alarm that meant potential explosive device detected. Jake's expression shifted from casual mockery to confusion, then to the kind of focused alertness that 3 years of security training had drilled into all of us. Other passengers in line began looking around nervously, sensing the change in atmosphere even if they couldn't identify the source. The supervisor's voice crackled through my earpiece within seconds. "Station 7, what's your status?" I could hear the tension threading through his normally calm tone. In 3 years of working this checkpoint, I'd seen the explosive detection system trigger, maybe a dozen times, and every single incident had turned out to be a false positive. Forgotten electronics, dense organic materials, sometimes just a glitch in the aging equipment. But the pattern on my screen wasn't ambiguous. It was textbook explosive device configuration, the kind they'd shown us in training videos with warnings that we'd probably never encounter it in real life. "Possible IED in passenger baggage," I responded, following protocol while keeping my voice low enough that the growing line of travelers couldn't hear the specifics. "Need immediate supervisor response and possible evacuation procedures." The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. In training scenarios, you went through the motions knowing it was all pretend. In real life, your hands started shaking and your mouth went dry because the stakes were suddenly, terrifyingly real. Margaret Chen stood patiently by the metal detector, seemingly unaware that her purse had just triggered the most serious security alert our checkpoint had seen in years. She adjusted her reading glasses and glanced around with the mild curiosity of someone wondering why the line had suddenly stopped moving. There was nothing in her demeanor to suggest guilt, fear, or even awareness that anything unusual was happening. If she was a threat, she was either the most accomplished actress in the world or completely oblivious to what was inside her own purse. Jake had moved to position himself between Margaret and the other passengers, a subtle shift that looked casual but followed our training for potential threat containment. His earlier smirk had vanished completely, replaced by the kind of focused attention that meant his brain had switched from routine operation to crisis management. Other TSA agents at nearby stations were beginning to notice the change in atmosphere. The way conversations had dropped to whispers and movements had become more deliberate. Supervisor Elena Rodriguez appeared with the speed that came from 20 years of airport security experience. She was the kind of professional who could assess a situation, make critical decisions, and implement emergency procedures without ever appearing to rush or panic. Her presence immediately elevated the tension level for everyone in uniform, while somehow making the civilian passengers feel more secure. She glanced at my monitor, and I watched her expression shift as she processed what she was seeing. "Clear the area," she said quietly into her radio. "Code yellow, checkpoint 7. Maintain normal operations at all other stations." Code yellow meant potential explosive device, the designation that would bring bomb disposal units, federal agents, and emergency response teams cascading into our normally routine environment. But it also meant we had perhaps 15 minutes before this section of the airport would be swarming with specialists who might not appreciate subtlety or nuance in their response. Margaret seemed to finally notice that she'd become the center of attention. She looked from Jake to Elena to me with the expression of someone trying to understand why her simple trip through security had suddenly become complicated. "Is there a problem with my purse?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight confusion of someone who genuinely didn't understand what was happening. "I packed it carefully. I don't think I have any liquids over the size limit." Elena approached her with the practiced calm that came from thousands of passenger interactions. But I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Ma'am, we need to conduct some additional screening on your belongings. This is just a routine procedure, but I'm going to need you to step over here with me." She gestured toward a private screening area, a glass-walled room where more intensive searches could be conducted away from the main passenger flow. The next few minutes moved with a strange combination of urgency and careful procedure that defined emergency response in controlled environments. Other passengers were quietly redirected to different security lanes, a process that looked routine but effectively cleared our immediate area of potential collateral damage. Additional TSA agents appeared at strategic positions, their presence professional but unmistakably focused on the small woman with the bright pink purse, who still seemed genuinely confused about why she'd become the center of so much attention. Margaret cooperated with every request, following Elena to the private screening room with the patient compliance of someone accustomed to dealing with bureaucracy. She answered questions about her travel plans, her destination, the contents of her purse, all with the straightforward honesty of someone who had nothing to hide. She was flying to visit her daughter in Phoenix, she explained. The purse was new, a gift from her granddaughter who thought she needed something more colorful in her wardrobe. She'd packed it that morning with her usual travel essentials. But the X-ray image didn't lie. Dense, geometric shapes that could only be explosive components, arranged in patterns that suggested sophisticated understanding of bomb construction. Either Margaret Chen was one of the most accomplished terrorists in history, or something else was happening that none of us understood. Elena's questions became more specific, more probing, but Margaret's answers remained consistent and seemingly genuine. The bomb disposal unit arrived with the quiet efficiency that marked all elite emergency response teams. They weren't the dramatic, movie-style specialists who announced their presence with sirens and shouting. They were professionals who understood that real explosive threats required calm expertise, not theatrical displays. The team leader, a woman in her 40s with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of dealing with things that could kill you if you made a mistake, conferred quietly with Elena before approaching the screening room. Through the glass walls, I watched Margaret's expression change as she saw the bomb disposal specialists. For the first time since this whole situation began, she looked genuinely surprised. Not guilty, not caught, but surprised in a way that suggested she was seeing something she hadn't expected. She leaned forward slightly, studying the team's equipment and procedures with an intensity that seemed oddly professional for a civilian grandmother. The bomb disposal team began their preliminary assessment of the purse, using portable scanning equipment that could provide more detailed analysis than our standard X-ray machines. Their movements were methodical, careful, following protocols designed to minimize risk while gathering maximum information. But as they worked, I noticed something strange. Margaret wasn't watching them with the fearful fascination most civilians showed when confronted with explosive disposal procedures. She was watching with the critical evaluation of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why. One of the specialists made an adjustment to his scanning equipment, and Margaret spoke for the first time since the bomb disposal team had arrived. "You might want to recalibrate that detector," she said quietly. "The sensitivity settings look too high for close-range analysis. You're probably getting interference from the normal electronic components." The specialist stopped what he was doing and looked at her with the expression of someone who'd just heard a civilian explain rocket science. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain quiet while we complete our assessment," he said, following standard procedure for keeping potential threats from interfering with disposal operations. But Margaret continued, her voice taking on a different quality, more authoritative and precise. "The primary charge indicator you're seeing is probably the lithium battery pack in my emergency beacon. It's military specification, higher density than civilian electronics. The secondary signatures are likely capacitor banks from the signal amplification system. If you adjust your scanner to exclude frequencies above 12 kHz, you should get a clearer reading on the actual threat assessment." The bomb disposal specialist exchanged glances with his team leader. What Margaret had just said wasn't the kind of information you picked up from watching television shows about explosives. It was technical knowledge that came from hands-on experience with military-grade detection equipment and explosive device analysis. The team leader approached the glass partition with a new expression, not the patient professionalism she'd shown when dealing with a potential civilian threat, but the focused attention of one professional recognizing another. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm going to need you to explain how you know about scanner calibration procedures and military specification electronic components." Margaret looked around the room at the assembled security personnel, bomb disposal specialists, and federal agents who had quietly joined the response team. Her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like resignation, as if she'd hoped to avoid this conversation but realized it was now inevitable. "Because," she said with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, "I spent 32 years doing your job before I retired to Phoenix to be closer to my grandchildren." The silence that followed was absolute. Elena looked from Margaret to the bomb disposal team leader to the X-ray image still glowing on my monitor, trying to reconcile the information that wasn't adding up. Jake had gone completely still, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by the stunned realization that his assumptions might have been catastrophically wrong. Margaret reached slowly into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a thin leather wallet. From it, she produced an identification card that she handed to the bomb disposal team leader through the glass partition secure slot. The team leader examined it carefully, then showed it to Elena, whose expression shifted from professional caution to something approaching amazement. "Retired Master Sergeant Margaret Chen," Elena read aloud. "United States Army Explosive Ordnance Disposal. Security clearance level." She paused, looking at Margaret with new eyes. "Ma'am, your clearance level is above my access authorization." Margaret nodded with the patient acknowledgement of someone who'd spent decades dealing with security protocols and bureaucratic complications. "The equipment in my purse isn't an explosive device," she explained. "It's an emergency communication system designed for high-risk environments. Encrypted satellite uplink, emergency beacon, signal amplification for remote communication. It's perfectly legal for retired EOD personnel to carry, but I understand why it would trigger your detection systems." The bomb disposal team leader was studying Margaret's identification with the intense focus of someone cross-referencing information against databases that most people didn't know existed. After several minutes of quiet communication with federal agencies whose acronyms I'd never heard of, she looked up with an expression that had shifted from cautious professionalism to something approaching respect. "Master Sergeant Chen," she said, using Margaret's military rank for the first time, Your service record indicates deployment to some of the most dangerous EOD operations in recent military history. Multiple commendations for explosive disposal under combat conditions, advanced certifications in chemical and biological hazard mitigation, and instructor-level qualifications for training other EOD specialists. Margaret shrugged with the same dismissive gesture she'd used when explaining her travel plans, as if 32 years of defusing bombs was just another job detail. I did my service, now I'm retired, and I just want to visit my daughter without causing an international incident at airport security. But the bomb disposal team leader wasn't finished reviewing Margaret's credentials. Ma'am, according to your service record, you were the lead EOD specialist for Operation Desert Shield, the disposal expert for the embassy incident in Somalia, and the primary instructor for advanced explosive device recognition at Fort Leonard Wood. You've personally disarmed more explosive devices than most of our current team combined. The weight of that information settled over our small group like a physical presence. Here was a woman who'd spent 3 decades dealing with explosive threats that could level buildings, and we'd been treating her like a potential security risk because she carried her emergency equipment in a pink Hello Kitty purse. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, but it also highlighted something more serious about assumptions, appearances, and the dangerous territory between perception and reality. Elena cleared her throat, clearly struggling with how to proceed with a situation that had moved far beyond normal security protocols. Master Sergeant Chen, we owe you an apology for the inconvenience. Your equipment will be cleared for transport, and we'll make sure you reach your gate with minimal further delay. But Margaret held up a hand with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. Actually, she said, glancing at the bomb disposal team's equipment setup, before I go, you might want to know that your threat assessment protocols could use some updating. The scanning configuration you're using would miss several types of modern explosive devices, and your response positioning would leave your team vulnerable to secondary detonations if this had been a real threat. The bomb disposal team leader looked intrigued rather than offended. What would you recommend? Margaret's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a professional discussing her area of expertise. Well, for starters, your portable scanner should be configured for multi-layer analysis rather than single-frequency detection. Modern improvised explosive devices often use shielding techniques that can fool standard screening equipment. And your team positioning assumes a traditional timer-based device, but most current threats use proximity triggers or remote detonation systems that require different safety protocols. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret Chen transformed from a potential security threat into an impromptu instructor, sharing insights that came from decades of real-world experience with explosive threats. The bomb disposal team took notes, asked detailed questions, and exchanged the kind of technical information that could mean the difference between successful disposal and catastrophic failure in actual emergency situations. As I watched this transformation unfold, I realized I was witnessing something remarkable. Not just the revelation that appearances could be deceiving, but the recognition that expertise often came in unexpected packages. Margaret's pink purse and floral sundress had been camouflage as effective as any military uniform, allowing her to move through the world without the constant awareness that would have followed someone whose appearance matched their capabilities. The federal agents who'd arrived as part of the emergency response team were quietly updating their incident reports, changing threat assessment to consultation with retired military specialists. Elena was already discussing how Margaret's recommendations could be incorporated into training protocols for other security checkpoints. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake stood quietly to one side, and I could see him processing the reality that his casual dismissal had been directed at someone whose experience made his 3 years of security work look like a weekend hobby. Margaret finally gathered her belongings, carefully packing her emergency communication equipment back into the pink purse that had started this entire incident. As she prepared to leave for her delayed flight to Phoenix, the bomb disposal team leader approached her one final time. "Master Sergeant Chen," she said, "if you're ever interested in consulting work, the Federal EOD training program could use someone with your experience and perspective. We've learned more in the past hour than most training exercises teach in a week." Margaret smiled with genuine warmth, the expression of someone who'd found unexpected satisfaction in sharing knowledge she'd spent a lifetime acquiring. "I'll think about it," she said. "But right now, I have a granddaughter's piano recital to attend, and she'll never forgive me if I miss it because I got detained at airport security explaining why I carry professional-grade emergency equipment in a Hello Kitty purse." As she walked toward the departure gates, her pink purse jingling softly with each step, I found myself thinking about assumptions, appearances, and the dangerous comfort of judging people by superficial characteristics. Margaret Chen had spent 32 years protecting people from explosive threats, and we'd almost treated her like one because she didn't look like our mental image of a bomb disposal expert. The checkpoint returned to its normal rhythm, passengers flowing through security with the usual mix of impatience and resignation. But something had changed in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the way we looked at each traveler, a new awareness that expertise and experience could wear any face, carry any purse, and move through the world in ways that challenged every assumption we thought we could safely make. The aftermath of Margaret's departure rippled through the checkpoint in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but would prove lasting. Jake stood at his metal detector station, mechanically waving passengers through while clearly processing what had just happened. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the private screening room where we'd detained someone whose experience in explosive disposal exceeded that of our entire security team combined. His usual running commentary about passengers had vanished, replaced by a thoughtful silence that suggested he was reconsidering every assumption he'd made about the people passing through our checkpoint. Elena gathered the bomb disposal team's preliminary report and Margaret's recommendations into a folder that would eventually make its way to federal training facilities across the country. But before filing it away, she called our entire shift together for an impromptu debriefing session, something that had never happened in my 3 years at this checkpoint. We assembled in the break room, a cramped space with fluorescent lighting and motivational posters about vigilance and security protocols that suddenly seemed inadequate for the conversation we were about to have. "What happened today," Elena began, choosing her words carefully, "represents both a failure and an opportunity for all of us. We successfully identified potential explosive components using our screening equipment, which means our technology and training worked as designed. But we also made assumptions about threat assessment based on appearance rather than evidence, which could have led to a very different outcome if we'd been dealing with an actual hostile situation." The bomb disposal team leader, who'd introduced herself as Captain Sarah Martinez, had stayed for the debriefing at Elena's request. Her perspective carried weight that went beyond our normal airport security protocols, representing years of field experience with actual explosive threats in combat zones and urban environments. She spread Margaret's service record across the break room table, a collection of commendations and mission reports that read like a catalog of the most dangerous EOD operations of the past 3 decades. Master Sergeant Chen's career included disposal of improvised explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan, chemical weapon disposal in Syria, and training responsibility for over 200 EOD specialists who are currently serving in active duty positions around the world, Captain Martinez explained. Her expertise in explosive threat recognition and disposal procedures exceeds that of most current military personnel, and her insights about our screening protocols identified vulnerabilities that could have serious security implications. Quote, Jake raised his hand hesitantly, his earlier confidence completely absent. "Ma'am, how were we supposed to know?" She looked like someone's grandmother going on vacation. Nothing about her appearance suggested military background or explosive expertise. His question carried genuine confusion rather than defensiveness, the honest bewilderment of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. Captain Martinez nodded with understanding rather than criticism. "That's exactly the point, and it's exactly what makes Master Sergeant Chen so valuable as a teaching example. Real expertise doesn't announce itself with uniforms or obvious displays. Some of the most skilled professionals I've worked with could blend into any crowd, appear completely ordinary, and move through hostile environments without drawing attention, precisely because they don't match popular expectations of what a dangerous person looks like." She pulled out her tablet and showed us photographs from various military operations, images of EOD specialists in action that painted a very different picture from Hollywood representations of bomb disposal experts. The photos showed men and women of all ages, builds, and backgrounds, united only by their calm professionalism when dealing with explosive threats that could kill them if they made a single mistake. Some looked like athletes, others like accountants, and several could have easily been Margaret's neighbors in any suburban community. "The enemy adapts," Captain Martinez continued. Modern explosive threats don't always come from obvious sources or in recognizable packages. The person carrying a bomb might be a teenager with a backpack, an elderly man with a walking cane, or a middle-aged woman with a pink purse. Our response protocols need to focus on evidence and behavior rather than appearance and assumptions. Elena opened Margaret's folder and began reading specific recommendations that would reshape how our checkpoint operated. Margaret had identified weaknesses in our scanning procedures, gaps in our threat assessment protocols, and positioning errors that could prove fatal if we ever faced a real explosive device. But more importantly, she'd highlighted the danger of unconscious bias in security work, the tendency to focus attention on people who look threatening, while overlooking actual threats that came in unexpected packages. Effective immediately, Elena announced, we're implementing new procedures based on Master Sergeant Chen's recommendations. Scanning equipment will be recalibrated for multi-layer analysis. Team positioning during threat response will be adjusted to account for modern detonation systems. And all personnel will receive additional training on recognizing expertise and professional competence regardless of civilian appearance. The implications went beyond our specific checkpoint. Word of Margaret's consultation was already spreading through federal security networks, generating interest from training facilities that wanted to incorporate her insights into standard procedures. Her casual 20-minute explanation of modern explosive threats had identified vulnerabilities that years of routine training had missed, demonstrating the value of real-world experience over theoretical knowledge. But the most significant change was harder to quantify and more difficult to measure. It was the shift in how we looked at passengers. The new awareness that appearances could be not just deceiving but completely irrelevant to actual capability or threat level. Margaret had walked through our checkpoint carrying sophisticated military equipment while looking like someone who baked cookies for church functions, and our initial response had been to dismiss her as harmless rather than recognize her as extraordinarily skilled. Jake approached me after the debriefing with an expression I'd never seen from him before, a combination of humility and genuine curiosity that replaced his usual casual arrogance. How many people do you think we see every day who have skills or experience we never recognize? He asked. How many retired military specialists, former law enforcement officers, or other professionals pass through here while we're making jokes about their appearance or travel habits? It was a sobering question that didn't have an easy answer. Our checkpoint processed thousands of passengers each week. A continuous stream of humanity representing every possible background, profession, and life experience. Among them were almost certainly retired intelligence officers, former special forces operatives, accomplished scientists, skilled physicians, and other professionals whose expertise could fill libraries, but who moved through airport security as anonymous travelers carrying ordinary luggage. Captain Martinez overheard our conversation and joined us with additional perspective from her military experience. In combat zones, you learn quickly that the most dangerous enemies often look completely harmless, and some of your most valuable allies appear unremarkable until circumstances require them to demonstrate their capabilities. Survival depends on recognizing that appearance is tactical camouflage, not reliable intelligence. She told us about operations where retired military personnel living as civilians had provided crucial assistance during emergency situations, their decades of training and experience suddenly becoming relevant when disasters struck or security threats emerged. Teachers who turned out to be former combat medics, shopkeepers who were retired communications specialists, grandmothers who had clearance levels that exceeded most active duty personnel. Master Sergeant Chen represents something we see frequently in military communities but rarely recognize in civilian settings, Captain Martinez explained. She's someone whose professional competence was forged in extreme circumstances, but who chose to transition into quiet retirement without broadcasting her background or seeking recognition for her service. The pink purse isn't just personal preference, it's operational camouflage that allows her to move through the world without constantly being identified as someone with specialized skills. The federal agents who'd responded to our Code Yellow were conducting their own analysis of the incident, generating reports that would influence security protocols at airports across the country. But their focus went beyond Margaret's specific case to examine broader questions about threat assessment, professional recognition, and the challenge of maintaining security in environments where both threats and assets could appear in any form. Agent Rebecca Torres, who'd arrived with the initial federal response team, explained how Margaret's case would be used in training scenarios for new security personnel. This incident provides a perfect example of why we can't rely on profiling or appearance-based assumptions in security work. A real terrorist could easily use the same camouflage that Master Sergeant Chen employed unintentionally, appearing harmless while carrying actual threats. The training implications were significant and far-reaching. Margaret's recommendations would be incorporated into federal security protocols, but her case would also become a teaching tool for recognizing the difference between appearance and capability. 3 weeks after Margaret's flight to Phoenix, Elena received a thank you note written on stationery, decorated with cartoon characters that matched her famous purse. The note was brief but included technical specifications for upgraded scanning equipment that could better identify sophisticated explosive threats, along with contact information for a consulting firm that specialized in security protocol development for high-risk environments. The return address showed Phoenix, Arizona, but the letter had indicated that Margaret had come out of retirement to establish a training company that provided expertise to law enforcement and security agencies. Her granddaughter's piano recital had apparently inspired her to consider how she could use her decades of experience to help the next generation of security professionals avoid the kinds of assumptions that had nearly classified her as a threat rather than recognizing her as an asset. Jake framed Margaret's business card and kept it at his workstation as a daily reminder that competence could wear any face and expertise could carry any purse. Other checkpoint personnel began sharing stories of passengers they'd initially dismissed who later proved to have remarkable backgrounds and capabilities, creating a new awareness of the hidden depths that existed in the anonymous crowd of travelers we processed each day. The pink Hello Kitty purse became legendary in our facility, a symbol of the dangerous territory between appearance and reality that defined much of security work. New personnel heard Margaret's story as part of their orientation training, learning that effective threat assessment required looking beyond surface characteristics to evaluate actual evidence and behavioral indicators. Margaret's case study was eventually incorporated into federal training curricula, used to teach thousands of security personnel about the importance of evidence-based assessment over appearance-based assumptions. Her 20-minute consultation had identified vulnerabilities that years of routine training had missed, demonstrating that experience often trumped protocol when it came to recognizing and responding to actual threats. But the most important lesson wasn't technical or procedural. It was the recognition that expertise existed everywhere, often hidden behind ordinary appearances and carried by people who chose anonymity over recognition. Margaret Chen had spent 32 years protecting others from explosive threats, and she'd almost been treated as one because we'd confused capability with appearance, competence with costume. The quiet grandmother with the sparkly purse had reminded us that legends walked among us every day, wearing unremarkable clothes, carrying civilian identification, and moving through the world without announcing their extraordinary capabilities. Sometimes it took a code yellow alarm and a bomb disposal team to reveal that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the one who looked threatening, but the one who'd spent decades learning how to neutralize the threats that others couldn't even recognize. 6 months later, I found myself standing in a federal training facility in Quantico, Virginia, watching Margaret Chen address a room full of security professionals who represented agencies from across the country. She wore the same type of floral dress that had made her seem so ordinary at our checkpoint, but now I understood that her appearance was as deliberately chosen as any tactical equipment. The pink purse sat on the podium beside her presentation materials, no longer a symbol of harmless grandmotherly habits, but a reminder that assumptions could be more dangerous than any explosive device. The audience included TSA supervisors, federal air marshals, bomb disposal specialists, and intelligence analysts who'd traveled from dozens of facilities to hear Margaret's presentation on modern threat assessment protocols. Her consulting company had grown rapidly, driven by word-of-mouth recommendations from agencies that had implemented her security improvements and discovered vulnerabilities they'd never recognized in their existing procedures. Margaret began her presentation with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used when explaining scanner calibration to our bomb disposal team. "How many of you would detain me for additional screening if I walked through your checkpoint today?" she asked the assembled professionals. A few hands went up tentatively, but most of the audience remained silent, already aware of Margaret's background and the point she was making about appearance-based assumptions. "Good," Margaret said with a slight smile. "Because if you're basing threat assessment on demographic profiling rather than behavioral analysis and evidence evaluation, you're probably missing the real threats while focusing attention on harmless travelers." She clicked to her first slide, showing surveillance footage from airports around the world where actual security threats had been missed because perpetrators didn't match expected profiles. The presentation that followed was unlike any training session I'd ever attended. Margaret didn't just explain theoretical concepts or recite procedural guidelines. She shared case studies from her 3 decades of EOD work, describing situations where appearances had been deliberately crafted to deceive security personnel, and how proper threat assessment could identify dangerous individuals regardless of their chosen camouflage. She showed photographs of explosive devices she'd personally disarmed, some hidden in children's toys, others disguised as medical equipment, and several concealed in luggage that would have passed through standard security screening without triggering any alarms. Each example reinforced her central message that effective security required looking beyond surface characteristics to evaluate actual evidence of threat or capability. The person most likely to successfully carry explosives through your checkpoint, Margaret explained, is someone who understands your screening procedures well enough to circumvent them, who appears harmless enough to avoid additional scrutiny, and who behaves confidently enough to suggest they belong in your environment. Those characteristics have nothing to do with age, gender, ethnicity, or fashion choices. During the break, I approached Margaret to thank her for the changes her recommendations had brought to our facility. Our checkpoint had become a model for evidence-based threat assessment, and other airports were implementing similar protocols based on her consultation work. But more importantly, our team had developed a new appreciation for the complexity and skill required for effective security work. Margaret remembered me immediately, asking about Jake and Elena and the other personnel she'd met during her memorable transit through our security checkpoint. "Has the culture changed?" she asked, genuinely curious about whether her brief intervention had created lasting improvements in how we approached our work. "Completely," I told her honestly. "We still use your case study in training new personnel, and Jake has become one of our best instructors for teaching evidence-based assessment techniques. Elena says our threat detection accuracy has improved significantly since we stopped making assumptions based on passenger appearance." Margaret nodded with satisfaction, but her expression suggested she was thinking about broader implications beyond our specific facility. "The real test isn't whether you remember my case," she said. "It's whether you apply the same principles to passengers who don't have dramatic reveal moments. Most people with valuable skills or dangerous capabilities will never be forced to demonstrate them publicly. Your job is to recognize both threats and assets without requiring crisis situations to reveal true competence." The afternoon session focused on practical exercises where attendees analyzed video footage of real security checkpoint interactions, identifying moments where appearance-based assumptions had influenced decision-making processes. Margaret provided commentary that revealed details most of us had missed, behavioral indicators that suggested military training, crisis management experience, or familiarity with security protocols that went beyond normal civilian knowledge. One particularly instructive example showed a man in expensive business attire whose confident navigation of security procedures and professional interaction with screening equipment suggested law enforcement background. Standard profiling might have classified him as a low-risk business traveler, but Margaret pointed out subtle indicators that revealed extensive training in surveillance detection and counterintelligence techniques. "Notice how he positions himself to maintain visual contact with multiple exit routes," Margaret explained. "Watch his scan pattern when he enters the checkpoint area, systematic evaluation of personnel positions and equipment placement. Those aren't behaviors you develop in corporate boardrooms. That's tactical awareness from someone with extensive field experience in hostile environments." The revelation that the businessman was actually a retired CIA operative who'd spent 20 years in deep cover assignments drove home Margaret's point about the inadequacy of appearance-based threat assessment. Someone with his background could easily pose security risks if hostile, or provide valuable assistance during emergencies if friendly, but neither possibility would be recognized through standard profiling techniques. Another case study showed an elderly woman whose slow movement and apparent frailty had led security personnel to provide assistance rather than additional screening. Margaret's analysis revealed that the woman's positioning, timing, and knowledge of checkpoint procedures suggested extensive reconnaissance and preparation that went far beyond normal travel planning. She knows exactly where cameras are positioned, understands shift change schedules, and has timed her arrival to coincide with the busiest processing period when personnel attention is divided, Margaret noted. Those might be innocent travel preferences, or they might indicate hostile surveillance and attack preparation. The point is that you can't determine threat level by looking at her appearance or making assumptions about elderly travelers. The woman in the footage turned out to be a retired military intelligence officer who was testing checkpoint security as part of a federal assessment program, but Margaret's analysis showed how easily the same techniques could be used by actual threats who understood how to exploit appearance-based assumptions and security vulnerabilities. During the final session, Margaret addressed questions from facility supervisors who were struggling to implement evidence-based assessment techniques in environments where rapid passenger processing was essential. The challenge of maintaining security effectiveness while avoiding lengthy delays required balancing thoroughness with efficiency, particularly during peak travel periods when thousands of passengers needed to be screened within limited timeframes. The goal isn't to subject every passenger to intensive investigation, Margaret explained. It's to develop the professional judgment needed to recognize when additional attention is warranted based on evidence rather than assumptions. Most travelers require only standard screening, but you need the skills to identify the exceptions without relying on demographic shortcuts that miss real threats while targeting harmless individuals. She described a training methodology she'd developed that used graduated scenario exercises to help security personnel recognize subtle behavioral indicators that suggested either threat potential or professional competence. The training focused on observation skills, pattern recognition, and decision-making under pressure, capabilities that could improve both security effectiveness and operational efficiency. Margaret's consulting work had expanded beyond airport security to include training for local law enforcement agencies, federal protective services, and international security organizations that were grappling with similar challenges. Her reputation had grown through professional networks, where her practical experience and teaching ability were generating demand for expertise that couldn't be duplicated through traditional training programs. The federal training facility where we were meeting had become a regular venue for Margaret's courses, and I learned that waiting lists for her programs extended months into the future. Agencies were discovering that her real-world experience provided insights that transformed their approach to threat assessment and professional recognition, leading to improved security outcomes and reduced false positive incidents. But Margaret's influence extended beyond formal training programs. She'd begun writing technical papers for security journals, contributing to research projects that studied the effectiveness of different threat assessment methodologies, and consulting on policy development for federal agencies that were updating their security protocols based on evolving threat landscapes. During the final presentation, Margaret showed a photograph that had become iconic in security training circles. It was a picture of her pink Hello Kitty purse sitting on a conference table surrounded by sophisticated explosive detection equipment, a visual reminder of the gap between appearance and capability that define much of modern security work. "This purse has become more famous than I ever intended," Margaret said with genuine amusement. "But it serves an important purpose as a teaching tool. Every time security personnel see it, they're reminded that threats and assets both come in unexpected packages, and that effective security requires looking beyond surface characteristics to evaluate actual evidence." The audience of security professionals laughed, but it was the knowing laughter of people who'd learned similar lessons through their own experiences with the challenges of appearance-based assessment. Many of them shared stories of incidents where their initial assumptions about passengers or situations had been proven completely wrong, leading to embarrassing mistakes or missed opportunities for threat detection. Margaret concluded her presentation with practical recommendations for implementing evidence-based assessment techniques in real-world security environments. Her suggestions focused on training improvements, procedural modifications, and cultural changes that could help security organizations move beyond demographic profiling toward more effective threat recognition methodologies. "The most important change isn't technical or procedural," Margaret emphasized. "It's developing the professional humility to recognize that your assumptions might be wrong, and the investigative curiosity to look deeper when evidence suggests something beyond normal expectations. Those qualities can't be programmed into scanning equipment or mandated through policy directives. They have to be cultivated through experience and reinforced through training." After the formal presentation ended, I stayed for the informal discussion session, where Margaret answered specific questions from individual agencies about implementing her recommendations in their particular operating environments. The conversations were highly technical, focusing on detailed aspects of threat assessment that revealed the depth of knowledge required for effective security work. One TSA supervisor from Los Angeles described how Margaret's protocols had helped his team identify a passenger carrying components for an improvised explosive device, materials that had been concealed in everyday items that wouldn't have triggered standard screening procedures. The successful detection had prevented a potential aviation security incident, demonstrating the practical value of Margaret's evidence-based assessment techniques. Another participant, a federal air marshal from Miami, explained how Margaret's training had helped her recognize a fellow law enforcement officer who was traveling undercover on a sensitive assignment. The ability to identify professional competence without compromising operational security had facilitated coordination that improved safety for both passengers and crew during a flight that encountered unexpected turbulence and emergency landing procedures. Margaret listened to each story with the careful attention of someone who understood that security work was ultimately about protecting people, and that every successful threat detection or professional recognition had human consequences that extended far beyond procedural compliance. Her responses combined technical expertise with genuine empathy for the challenges faced by security personnel who were responsible for making split-second decisions with incomplete information. As the session concluded, Margaret distributed business cards and contact information for her consulting company, but she also provided personal email addresses for security personnel who might encounter situations where her expertise could be helpful. Security work is collaborative, she explained. None of us has all the answers, but sharing knowledge and experience makes everyone more effective. The drive back to Denver gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since Margaret's initial transit through our checkpoint. What had begun as a routine security screening had evolved into a case study that was influencing training programs across the country, generating research into threat assessment methodologies, and changing how thousands of security personnel approached their daily responsibilities. But the most significant change was personal. Margaret's example had taught me to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize that competence and expertise could wear any face, and to approach each passenger interaction with the understanding that assumptions were more dangerous than any item that might trigger our scanning equipment. When I returned to work the following week, I found that our checkpoint had been selected to pilot new assessment techniques based on Margaret's latest research. The protocols focused on behavioral observation rather than demographic profiling, evidence evaluation rather than appearance-based assumptions, and professional recognition skills that could identify both threats and assets without relying on stereotypical characteristics. Jake had been promoted to training supervisor, responsible for implementing the new procedures and educating other personnel about evidence-based threat assessment techniques. His transformation from someone who made jokes about passenger appearances to a skilled instructor who taught professional recognition skills demonstrated the lasting impact that Margaret's example had created in our workplace culture. Lena had been reassigned to a federal task force that was developing standardized protocols for security facilities across the country, carrying Margaret's influence to airports, government buildings, and other locations where threat assessment decisions had life-and-death consequences. The pink purse had become a symbol that appeared in training materials worldwide, reminding security personnel that expertise often came disguised as ordinary civilian appearance. 6 months after attending Margaret's presentation at Quantico, I received a package at our checkpoint with a return address from Phoenix, Arizona. Inside was a small replica of a Hello Kitty purse, pink and sparkly like the original, along with a note written in Margaret's precise handwriting. For someone who learned to look beyond appearances, use it to remind others that legends walk among us every day. The miniature purse now sits on my workstation, a daily reminder that competence doesn't announce itself with uniforms or credentials, that expertise can carry any package, and that the most important security skill is the professional judgment to recognize both threats and assets without being misled by surface characteristics or demographic assumptions. Margaret Chen had taught us that appearances could be tactical camouflage, that assumptions were security vulnerabilities, and that effective threat assessment required looking deeper than what met the eye. Her pink purse had become legendary not because it was unusual, but because it represented the universal truth that capability and character had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the skills, experience, and knowledge that people carried within themselves, hidden beneath whatever disguise they chose to wear, while moving through a world that too often confused appearance with reality. 2 years had passed since that morning when Margaret Chen's pink Hello Kitty purse had triggered alarms that changed everything we thought we knew about threat assessment and professional recognition. I was no longer working the X-ray machine at Checkpoint 7. Elena had recommended me for advancement to the federal training program, where I now spent my days teaching other security personnel about the dangerous territory between appearance and reality that Margaret had so dramatically illustrated. The classroom at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Brunswick, Georgia, was filled with the next generation of security professionals, men and women from airports, government facilities, and law enforcement agencies who were learning to navigate the complex challenges of modern threat assessment. On the wall behind my desk hung a framed photograph that had become as famous in security circles as any training manual. Margaret Chen's pink purse, sitting on a conference table surrounded by bomb disposal equipment, a visual reminder that expertise often came disguised as ordinary civilian appearance. My students represented dozens of agencies and countless hours of traditional training, but they were here because their supervisors had recognized that standard profiling techniques were inadequate for identifying both threats and assets in environments where appearance could be deliberately crafted to deceive. Margaret's case study had become the foundation for a new approach to security work that prioritized evidence over assumptions, behavioral analysis over demographic shortcuts. How many of you have ever completely misjudged someone based on their appearance? I asked the assembled class, the same question that had opened every training session since I'd begun teaching Margaret's methodologies. Every hand in the room went up without hesitation. Acknowledgement of the universal human tendency to make rapid assessments based on surface characteristics, rather than deeper evaluation of actual capability or intent. The stories that followed were remarkably similar across different agencies and geographic regions. Airport security personnel who'd missed threats because perpetrators didn't match expected profiles. Police officers who'd failed to recognize undercover colleagues, or retired military personnel who could have provided valuable assistance during emergency situations. Federal agents who'd overlooked valuable intelligence sources because witnesses didn't appear credible based on their clothing, age, or social status. But alongside the missed opportunities were success stories. Incidents where security personnel had applied Margaret's evidence-based assessment techniques to identify both threats and assets that would have been overlooked through traditional profiling methods. A TSA agent in Seattle, who'd recognized military training in a passenger's movement patterns and discovered he was carrying classified materials without proper authorization. A customs officer in Miami who'd identified smuggling behavior based on observation skills rather than demographic assumptions, leading to the largest drug interdiction in her facility's history. The most compelling success story came from my former colleague Jake, who traveled from Denver to share his experience with the new training class. His transformation from someone who made jokes about passenger appearances to a skilled instructor who taught behavioral recognition techniques demonstrated the practical value of Margaret's approach to security work. 2 weeks ago, Jake told the assembled students, I was working the metal detector when an elderly man approached my station. Everything about his appearance suggested harmless retiree. Cardigan sweater, walking cane, hearing aids, moves slowly and carefully. Standard profiling would have classified him as low risk, requiring only routine screening. Jake paused, letting the students process the setup before continuing with the rest of his story. But I'd learned to look beyond surface characteristics, to observe behavior patterns and movement efficiency, rather than making assumptions based on age or physical appearance. This man moved with tactical awareness that didn't match his apparent frailty. His scan pattern was systematic, professional, designed to gather intelligence rather than navigate unfamiliar surroundings. The additional screening that Jake had initiated, based on behavioral observation rather than demographic profiling, had revealed that the elderly passenger was carrying detailed surveillance notes about airport security procedures, shift schedules, and equipment placement. Further investigation had uncovered a sophisticated reconnaissance operation that was gathering intelligence for a planned attack on transportation infrastructure. The threat wasn't his appearance, Jake emphasized. It was his knowledge, his preparation, and his understanding of how to exploit our assumptions about harmless elderly travelers. If I'd relied on traditional profiling, he would have passed through security without additional attention, and we might never have discovered the intelligence-gathering operation until it was too late. Jake's story illustrated the core principle that Margaret had taught through her own dramatic example, that appearance was tactical camouflage, and effective security required looking deeper than surface characteristics to evaluate actual evidence of threat or capability. The elderly man's frail appearance had been as deliberately chosen as any military uniform, designed to avoid scrutiny while gathering information for hostile purposes. But the training program I was now teaching wasn't just about threat detection. Margaret's methodology emphasized the equal importance of recognizing professional competence and expertise that could provide valuable assistance during emergency situations. Security personnel needed to identify both dangers and assets, understanding that valuable capabilities often came disguised as ordinary civilian appearance. During the practical exercise portion of the training, I showed video footage from airports around the world where retired military personnel, former law enforcement officers, and other professionals had provided crucial assistance during crisis situations. In each case, their expertise had been initially overlooked because their appearance didn't match expectations of what a qualified professional should look like. One particularly instructive example showed surveillance footage from LaGuardia Airport during a medical emergency where a passenger had suffered cardiac arrest in the security checkpoint area. While uniformed personnel were calling for paramedics and trying to clear the area, a woman in paint-stained work clothes had quietly begun administering advanced life support procedures that kept the patient stable until professional medical help arrived. The woman turned out to be a retired Army combat medic who'd spent 15 years treating trauma casualties in battlefield conditions. Her expertise in emergency medicine exceeded that of most civilian first responders, but her appearance as a construction worker had led security personnel to initially dismiss her offers of assistance. Only the intervention of a supervisor who'd recognized professional competence despite civilian appearance had allowed her to provide life-saving medical care. "Notice her movement patterns," I explained to the students as we analyzed the footage. "Efficient, purposeful, no wasted motion when she approaches the patient. She's conducting systematic assessment procedures, checking vitals, establishing airway management. Those aren't skills you learn in basic first aid classes. That's advanced medical training from someone with extensive emergency care experience." The students began identifying similar indicators in other case studies. The confident way a retired police detective had managed crowd control during a bomb threat evacuation, the systematic approach a former military intelligence officer had used to coordinate with federal agents during a security incident, the precise technical knowledge a civilian contractor had demonstrated when helping repair critical security equipment during a system failure. Each example reinforced Margaret's central message that expertise existed everywhere, often hidden behind ordinary appearances and carried by people who chose anonymity over recognition. The challenge for security personnel was developing the professional judgment needed to recognize valuable capabilities without requiring crisis situations to reveal true competence. Margaret herself had become something of a legend in federal training circles, though she maintained the same preference for working behind the scenes that had characterized her entire career. Her consulting company had grown into a major contractor for security agencies worldwide, but she still insisted on conducting key training sessions personally rather than delegating instruction to subordinates. I'd stayed in touch with Margaret through professional networks and occasional correspondence, and her influence on security training continued to expand in ways that went far beyond her original airport encounter. She'd been instrumental in developing new assessment protocols for multiple federal agencies, contributing to research that was changing how security professionals approached their daily responsibilities. But Margaret's most significant contribution wasn't technical or procedural. It was the cultural shift she'd initiated in how security personnel thought about their work, moving from reactive threat detection toward proactive capability recognition. Her example had taught thousands of professionals to look beyond surface characteristics, to recognize that both threats and assets could wear any face, and to approach each interaction with the understanding that assumptions were more dangerous than any prohibited item. The training program I was teaching incorporated lessons that went beyond security work to address broader questions about professional recognition, unconscious bias, and the challenge of making accurate assessments in high-pressure environments where split-second decisions could have life-and-death consequences. Students learned observation skills, pattern recognition techniques, and decision-making methodologies that could improve their effectiveness in any profession requiring human assessment. During the final day of training, I shared Margaret's most recent communication, a letter she'd sent from her consulting work with international security organizations. She was now traveling regularly to airports, government facilities, and training centers around the world, spreading her evidence-based assessment methodology to security professionals who were grappling with similar challenges in different cultural and operational contexts. "The principles are universal," Margaret had written. "Appearance is tactical camouflage in every culture, assumptions are security vulnerabilities in every language, and expertise can wear any face in any country. The specific details change, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you recognize both threats and assets without being misled by surface characteristics that have nothing to do with actual capability or intent?" Margaret's international work had revealed that the tendency to make appearance-based assumptions was a global phenomenon that transcended cultural boundaries. Security personnel in every country struggled with the same challenges of balancing efficiency with thoroughness, maintaining vigilance without resorting to discriminatory profiling, and recognizing professional competence regardless of demographic characteristics. Her training programs were now being implemented in airports across Europe, Asia, and South America, adapting her core methodology to different operational environments while maintaining the essential focus on evidence-based assessment rather than appearance-based assumptions. The pink Hello Kitty purse had become an international symbol of the gap between perception and reality that defined modern security work. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Margaret's continuing influence was how her example had inspired other professionals to share their own expertise in unexpected ways. The training center received regular reports of retired military personnel, former law enforcement officers, and other skilled professionals who were volunteering their knowledge to improve security training and operational effectiveness. A retired Navy SEAL who worked as a high school janitor had begun providing tactical assessment training to local police departments. A former CIA analyst who ran a small-town bakery was consulting with federal agencies on intelligence evaluation techniques. A decorated Air Force pilot who drove a school bus was helping aviation security personnel understand aircraft vulnerabilities and protection strategies. Each of these professionals had learned from Margaret's example that expertise could be shared without sacrificing anonymity, that knowledge accumulated through years of specialized experience could benefit the next generation of security personnel, and that professional competence was too valuable to be hidden behind ordinary civilian appearances indefinitely. The ripple effects of Margaret's airport encounter had grown far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Her 20-minute explanation of scanner calibration procedures had evolved into a comprehensive training methodology that was influencing security operations worldwide. Her case study was being taught in federal training facilities, university criminal justice programs, and professional development courses for law enforcement agencies at every level of government. But the most important legacy wasn't institutional or procedural. It was personal, reflected in the thousands of security professionals who now approach their daily responsibilities with new awareness of the complexity and skill required for effective threat assessment. Margaret had taught them to look beyond surface characteristics, to recognize that competence could wear any face, and to understand that assumptions were more dangerous than any weapon that might pass through their screening equipment. As my current training class prepared to return to their home agencies, carrying Margaret's methodology to airports, government buildings, and law enforcement facilities across the country, I reflected on how a single morning at a security checkpoint had generated changes that would influence security work for decades to come. Margaret's pink purse had become more than a teaching tool. It was a symbol of the universal truth that expertise often came disguised as ordinary appearance. The students filed out of the classroom, each carrying copies of Margaret's latest training materials and contact information for her consulting company. They would return to environments where they'd apply evidence-based assessment techniques, recognize professional competence regardless of civilian appearance, and remember that the most dangerous assumptions were often the ones that seemed most reasonable based on surface characteristics. Jake stayed after the others had left, helping me prepare materials for the next training session while sharing updates from our old checkpoint in Denver. The facility had become a model for evidence-based security operations, regularly hosting visitors from other airports who wanted to learn how Margaret's methodology could be implemented in their own environments. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Margaret had chosen a different purse that day? Jake asked as we packed training materials into storage containers. Something black and professional looking instead of pink with cartoon characters? It was an interesting question that highlighted the role of chance in Margaret's dramatic revelation. If she'd carried conventional luggage, her emergency communication equipment might have triggered the same alarms, but the contrast between her appearance and her capabilities wouldn't have been nearly so striking. The Hello Kitty purse had amplified the lesson about assumptions and appearances, making her example more memorable and more effective as a teaching tool. I think Margaret would have found another way to make the same point, I replied. The purse was just packaging. The real lesson was about recognizing expertise regardless of how it's presented, and that message would have come through regardless of her fashion choices. But as I locked up the classroom and headed home, I realized that Jake's question touched on something deeper about Margaret's influence on security training. Her example had resonated so powerfully, not just because of the dramatic contrast between appearance and capability, but because it represented a universal truth about human nature and professional recognition that extended far beyond security work. Margaret Chen had taught us that competence doesn't require recognition, that expertise can wear any face, and that the most valuable people are often the ones you never see coming until circumstances force them to reveal their extraordinary capabilities. Her pink Hello Kitty purse had become legendary because it symbolized the gap between perception and reality that exists in every profession, every community, and every human interaction, where assumptions replace careful observation. The drive home gave me time to think about the hundreds of students I'd taught using Margaret's methodology, security professionals who are now applying evidence-based assessment techniques in airports, government facilities, and law enforcement agencies around the world. Each of them carried a piece of Margaret's wisdom about looking beyond surface characteristics, recognizing hidden expertise, and understanding that legends walked among us every day wearing ordinary faces and carrying unremarkable luggage. Margaret's story had become more than a case study in security training. It was a reminder that excellence often chose anonymity over attention, that the most skilled professionals frequently preferred to work behind the scenes rather than seek public recognition, and that true expertise revealed itself through competence rather than credentials. 2 years after that morning when alarms had screamed and assumptions had crumbled, Margaret Chen's influence continued to spread through professional networks that spanned continents and cultures. Her pink purse had triggered more than security alerts. It had initiated a fundamental shift in how people thought about appearance, capability, and the dangerous territory between what we see and what we assume. The legend of Margaret Chen would grow in the telling, as all good stories do, but the core truth would remain unchanged. That competence doesn't announce itself with fanfare, that expertise can carry any package, and that the most important skill in any profession requiring human assessment is the wisdom to look deeper than surface characteristics before making judgments that could have lasting consequences. And somewhere in Phoenix, Arizona, a grandmother with a famous pink purse was probably planning her next consulting assignment, ready to remind another group of professionals that legends walk among us every day, wearing ordinary clothes, carrying civilian identification, and moving through the world without announcing their extraordinary capabilities until circumstances require them to step out of the shadows and show the rest of us what real competence looks like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.